Hello everyone, sorry for being late. I was struggling with Zoom. Yes, my talk will about last 20 minutes. First, I'd like to give you, how can I, yes, can put it down. First, I will give you a brief introduction to the concept of commonism. Essentially, it's a generalization of the commons. Any resource can be made a commons. For a resource to be a commons, it must be commonly available and managed by a community. A commons is not just a resource, it's also the entire social process surrounding it. The same applies to commodities and capitalism. A commodity is not just a thing, it's a social relationship between people. At the systems level, we have commonism or capitalism. For a macro system to emerge from thousands of micro actions, there must be a general mediation process. In capitalism, this is realized via the market. In contrast, in communism, this is achieved through commoning, the social process of self-organization and coordination that creates and maintains the commons. Interpersonally, if we know everyone involved, this can be achieved through direct agreements. But transpersonally, where we no longer know the participants, this becomes much harder to accomplish. Here we need mediated agreements. But how can we build anonymous, coherent, transpersonal mediation at the macro level of society as a whole? The social relationship. See, the social relationships I mentioned before emerge from the mode of cooperation and the availability of required resources. While capitalism is based on property, which excludes others by law, communism is based on possession, which is the collective availability of the necessary means. While property has no time or physical integrity limitations, meaning it can be destroyed at will, possession is bound to the use of the resource and requires care during the period of use. A thing in possession is a land to uses by humankind. Private property requires exchange in order to travel from one to the other owner. Exchange is a mode of cooperation in which others also requires a property in order to receive commodities for their subsistence. If you don't own the means of production, you have to sell your labor force for money. Conversely, if you're a fortunate owner of these means, you must buy labor force to produce and sell commodities in order to make money to make a living from it. Property and exchange generate compulsion and exclusion. Conversely, in communism, possession is combined with voluntary cooperation. Both generate a logic of inclusion, because if you cannot force people to do what you want, you can only invite them. Voluntariness is essential because any form of coercion undermines motivation. Forcing people to work is an inhumane artifact of commodity-producing society, such as capitalism or real socialism. But how can the reliability and promptness of complex production chains can be guaranteed on the basis of voluntariness? In a capitalist system, each enterprise operates independent of the others. Markets mediate between enterprises and consumers using money numbers as a signifier. In contrast to the decentralized, stigmergic, by value mediation, of capitalism, communism involves polycentric, distributed coordination comprising a mixture of decentralized, regional, sectoral, and central elements. Regulatory signs are embedded in production, which is usually called in-kind coordination. Rather than using a separate by-value cycle with its own profit logic, all coordinating signs are part of the process itself. They are measured in tons, liters, temperatures, time, different qualities of materials, qualification of the workers, and so on. So the same applies to planning as to coordination. Planning is mostly done along production chains, since all steps in the chain must fit together in time. And then the question arises, how can central requirements and local wishes be aligned? Before going into more detail on the planning issue, I would like to make a brief excursus on needs and voluntariness, because from our view, this is a very important point. In most views, needs are reduced to what we want. However, these central vital or receiving needs, as I call them, are only half of the equation. The other half are the productive or contributing needs. Contribution, participation, caring, and proactive action are part of the societal nature of humans. We only feel safe when we have the means to proactively produce what we need now and in the future. This precaution is also a need. In capitalism, these two aspects are separated and distorted. Satisfying vital needs takes the form of commodity consumption in exchange for money, and productive needs manifest as forced, alienated labor separated from care. Traces of that distortion can be found in real socialism and many DEP approaches. For example, in the focus on provision in exchange for money or tokens, and in the assumption that people must be forced to do what they should do. Communism is simply a society in which people can fulfill their needs both receiving and contributing. This requires free access to the means of subsistence for all on the receiving side, and motivating societal conditions on the contributing side, which is only possible if contributions are voluntary. Now, let's jump to the 5 aspects of communist planning. The further away from production you are, the more alienated you are. This is why planning should be organized as close to production as possible. However, the diversity and complexity of tasks resulting from the variety of products leads to a combination of planning levels. Most of the planning can be done locally. Some requires regional or sectoral planning, and a few require central or global planning efforts. Polycentric networks are best suited to handling this diversity. Although the number of planning tasks creates a kind of a pyramid, the real planning structure is not hierarchical, but rather a network with multiple centers of planning and coordination. The red and orange nodes represent these centers, while the yellow nodes represent local production sites. However, local production does not mean isolated production. They are all part of a large combination of production sites embedded in production chains of different lengths. This brings us to the second point. Small commons enterprises can plan independently. This is the most direct form of planning and production. However, as commons grow, planning becomes a specialized task that can be outsourced to meta-commons. Meta-commons produce the infrastructure conditions that enable other commons to produce. In other words, they produce plans and coordination. Nevertheless, production chains may be too large even for meta-commons. To handle this, a long production chain can be split into sections. Technically, useful sets of commons can form federations, which meta-commons then plan for. Merging commons into a federation reduces the number of interfaces and thus the complexity within the federation. In other words, insourcing production means reducing manufacturing depth, whereas outsourcing means the opposite. It is as if parts of the production chain are folded or insourced or unfolded and outsourced, as this illustration might show. Depending on the concrete challenges of a complex production network, both can be useful measures. Now let's have a look into a key feature of communism, and I want to explain why it is so important. In short, having a unit of account creates 2 cycles within the economy, a needs-based cycle and an accounting cycle, which have special logics that are opposite in capitalism. Most, if not all, distortions stem from this dual logic. We conclude that we should plan with real variables, not with accounting variables. Real products reflect vital needs. For comparison, in capitalism, it is the so-called use value of the commodity. Similarly, people's real capabilities reflect productive needs. In capitalism, it is the use value of a specific commodity, the labor force. However, a single unit of account in capitalism, the value, abstracts from these qualities. The advantages and disadvantages of by-value accounting are closely linked. On the one hand, comparing incommensurable things allows for process optimization and decision-making based on numbers. On the other hand, number-based process optimization inevitably creates exclusions and externalities, such as environmental issues, poor care and working conditions, and other non-value aspects. This is why we reject by-value mediation. Communist planning in kind is both in situ and ex ante. In situ means that production and distribution take place in the same information realm. And ex ante means that the planning of production and distribution is done before products are produced and distributed. In situ planning enables all relevant aspects to be included, which sometimes required a deliberation process to determine what and how to include. This leads to increased planning efforts compared to token or money-based planning and simple process optimization. Yes. One alternative is scenario optimization, which involves calculating different scenarios based on real variables. This allows you to make an informed decision between different alternatives where the pros and cons are completely clear. Instead of creating externalities, decisions are made consciously, taking all facts into account. Transparent deliberation requires all that data, including agreements and production data, is open, accessible. This leads to the next point. In highly intertwined production processes, you can only adjust your local planning if you have full insight into the entire production chain. There is the narrative that this is impossible, for example, in debates around the Supply Chain Act in Europe. But this is not true. Today, life cycle analysis enables us to obtain all necessary data from the final product upstream into all branches of the production chain. In order to reach agreement and make adjustments along the production chain, protocols and tools are needed to facilitate the commitment process. In the sense, all agree, production can go. Other models use centralized or cybernetic planning, which can even be found in capitalist production today. For example, Walmart uses ERP, enterprise resource planning. But this is a hierarchical tool designed to maximize profit. What we need is a kind of a democratic CRP, democratic chain resource planning. Although models for such democratic protocols already exist, for example, the activity pub protocol in Fediverse, we lack democratic CRP systems. The ultimate goal is nothing less than to replace anonymous market relations. Here is a sketch of a protocol-guided planning process. On the left-hand side, you can see a user of life or care means, such as a hospital, using an X-ray machine, for example. The X-ray machine is delivered to the hospital by the machine producer, who receives intermediate products to build the machine, and so on up to the resource generation. Black arrows indicate physical transfers, and red arrows indicate the information required to control the process. This information is fed into the so-called planning bus, in a structured way guided by a protocol. Societal goals are also fed into this bus, such as limits to production like maximum carbon emissions, etc. All data is open to public. However, this scenario works only for short production chains, or in other words, with a low manufacturing depth. Longer chains require a reduction in complexity through splitting the entire chain into the aforementioned federations. Specialized meta commons can plan and coordinate these federations. The individual production unit is then relieved of the need for complex communication with our production partners. At the same time, planning remains close to production compared to central planning. In communism, consultation is a peer relationship. There are stakeholders who are experts due to their actual or potential involvement, and reproducers who are the experts in creating the material, symbolic, and social means and services. The important point here is that the stakeholders also can organize themselves in commons, not only the reproducers. They are needed for production. In capitalism, success is clearly defined by the ability to sell commodities on market. Whether needs are covered is irrelevant because the main goal is profit. Without this indirect measure of success through market mediation, we can include needs directly in the planning and production process, and not only the receiving needs, but the contributing needs too. This means that semi-autonomy, which is the basic relationship between production commons, also applies to stakeholder commons. Their knowledge is needed to develop and improve planning and production. Moreover, think of stakeholders not only in terms of people who are directly affected, but also as experts who are familiar with the needs of those who cannot speak for various reasons, including those in the more than human world. However, this integration should not obscure the fact that receiving and contributing needs of stakeholders and producers with different focuses could be in tension. This tension can lead to innovation, but this is not guaranteed. In conclusion, I would say that consulting is deeply embedded in polycentric structures. Here you can see the extension of the previous graphs with the consultants unit. They are embedded in the entire federational planning process. I would like to emphasize that this sketch is just one possibility, but it's the most far-reaching one based on the basis of commons and commoning. You can imagine the old structure that we know from bourgeois society, such as representative parliaments, public votes, and even councils. These structures emerge in an exclusionary society of opposing interests, where one group's victory comes at the expense of another group and ultimately of the more than human world. The transition from capitalism to communism is a transition from exclusionary to inclusive logics, where differences are the source of creativity and energy. I'm a big fan of Jakob Heyer and Walter Zeug's cybernetic approach. When I elaborate on my critique below, I do so out of sympathy and in an attempt to improve their approach. A brief sketch. First, based on life cycle analysis I mentioned before, they propose calculating per capita budgets that respect planetary limits. These per capita budgets would then be distributed among 5 sectors: universal basic income, universal basic services, care, investment in the reserves. Secondly, they calculate a 3-dimensional price for all products, taking into account raw material use, CO2 equivalent emissions, and working time. Feedback loops are then used to align budgets and prices. Coordination takes place through limited markets and competition between the enterprises. Since tokens are non-circulating and non-accumulating, the good token good cycle is analogous to the commodity money commodity cycle that Marx identified in the 4 early stages of capitalism. This is what we get when you put the different approaches and the other different approaches in a diagram. Due to time limitations, I want to skip this diagram, but you can see cybernetism close to communism. It's on the way to communism, I would say, compared to the other approaches, free market as the current system and market socialism and state socialism as alternatives. But what are problems of the cybernetic model? While this model could provide a transitional path to communism, there are some potential pitfalls. Firstly, with a doubled cycle of goods and tokens operating under different logics, you might inherit a problem similar to that of capitalism, which I discussed previously. Secondly, the coupling of receiving and contributing undermines motivation and creates a compulsion to work, although this is mitigated due to the substantial general transfers to the people. Thirdly, enterprises must compete for tokens in order to produce. Thus, bankruptcy is possible. Fourthly, a state or a state-like institution with the power to redistribute taxes, UBS and UBI, is necessary, including having the power to control, sanction, and execute their power. And fifthly, it is unclear whether property rights would exist under this system, and if so, the destructive logic they would entail. In conclusion, I would say that using tokens, markets, the state, and competition as coordination mechanisms might eliminate inconvenient mediation tasks, but it could create many of the problems found in today's capitalism. So I would say it's a good approach, but not consequent enough to really break free from all the obstacles of capitalism. So from my point of view, integration with communism could be a good idea. Thank you.